The night was colder than Jada had expected. Rain slicked the streets in a thin, reflective sheen, and the dim glow of streetlights painted long, trembling shadows across the sidewalks. Her worn sneakers slapped softly against the asphalt as she hurried home, a single bag swinging at her side, heavy with the day's tips and her meager paycheck. The exhaustion in her bones pressed down like a weight, yet she forced her legs to keep moving, each step carrying her closer to safety, or at least the hope of it. It was late. Most people had retreated to their homes, leaving only the hum of distant traffic and the occasional flicker of neon signs. And yet, in that quiet, Jada felt eyes on her. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of danger slinking through the shadows just beyond her vision. Her heartbeat picked up. Not from the cold, but from something more primal. An instinct honed from years of walking streets alone, from years of being unseen until danger appeared. She tightened her grip on her bag, her knuckles whitening. Then she noticed them. A group of men had emerged from the corner, walking slowly and deliberately, keeping pace with her. She quickened her step, hoping the distance would break the connection, but they did too. Whispers and laughter, low enough not to be caught by anyone else, but sharp enough to slice through her calm. Catcalls she had heard 1,000 times, each one a reminder that the world had never seemed to care about her safety. Her pulse thumped in her ears. Every rational thought fought against the rising fear, trying to tell her it was probably nothing, that she'd just imagined it. But the way they angled their heads, their slow circling, the way their eyes lingered on her, this was no imagination. Jada's mind raced. The street seemed longer than it should, every shadow stretching, twisting, hiding threats in its folds. She thought of the shortcut through the alley but remembered the stories, too many stories of women who had taken it and never returned. She stayed on the main street, telling herself each step would be the one that brought her home safely. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out instinctively, thumb hovering over the call button, praying she wouldn't have to use it. The men noticed the movement and smirked. That smirk froze her. They knew she was alone. They knew she was vulnerable. A taxi drove by, headlights washing over her for a brief second, but there was no one inside. No one to help. Just her. The wet pavement reflected her own worried face back at her, pale in the dim light. She felt a lump in her throat, a mixture of exhaustion and fear, the kind that pressed down on your chest and made it hard to breathe. Then, as the men drew closer, something shifted in the air. A distant roar, low and mechanical, grew louder. Jada didn't understand at first. The hairs on her neck stood on end, not from fear but from recognition. Something or someone had noticed. And in that moment, she realized she was no longer alone. The rumble grew into a chorus of engines, chrome glinting under the streetlights, and suddenly the shadows themselves seemed to stand taller. A group of bikers, silhouettes framed against the rain-slicked asphalt, appeared behind her like guardians she hadn't known she needed. The men who had been following her faltered. Their smirks faded into uncertainty, and their steps slowed. Jada's heart raced, not from fear this time but from something new, a flicker of hope. She had been invisible, overlooked, and tired. But in this moment, someone had seen her. Someone had noticed. As the roar of the approaching engines faded into the background, Jada's mind flickered back to the beginning of her day, as though her exhaustion and fear had unlocked memories she carried like tiny, heavy stones in her chest. The morning had started before dawn. Her alarm rang like an insistent bell, dragging her from a sleep that had been too brief and too shallow, haunted by dreams of falling and of faces she couldn't recognize but that stared at her accusingly. She had rolled out of bed, ignoring the ache in her shoulders, and stepped into the worn sneakers that had carried her through months of double shifts, long walks, and countless moments of being overlooked. Her small apartment smelled faintly of coffee and stale bread. She had brewed a quick cup, bitter and dark, taking it to the counter where her few belongings sat neatly but sparsely, reminders of the life she managed to sustain on her own. Jada's reflection in the cracked kitchen window stared back at her. Tired eyes, faint bruises under her knuckles from carrying too much weight in her hands and on her back, and the faint lines that worry and responsibility had etched onto her face. Work had been grueling. She had been a waitress at a local diner for nearly 3 years, navigating the constant bustle of orders, the clatter of plates, and the exhaustion of polite smiles for customers who often saw her as invisible, or worse, as disposable. She had served a man who had slammed his fist on the counter earlier, angry that his coffee wasn't hot enough, and yet she had offered him a calm smile, soft enough to diffuse his frustration, strong enough to protect her dignity. She remembered another customer, a woman who had complimented her hair and skin, who had smiled and asked how her day was going. That moment had been like sunlight in the gray drizzle of her life, brief, unexpected, but powerful enough to remind her that kindness existed even if rarely. But for every small sunbeam there had been shadow, the sneers, the whispers, the men who assumed they had the right to comment on her body or her mannerisms. Those voices followed her long after the diner's doors closed. Her co-workers were a patchwork of exhaustion and humor, each carrying their own burdens, each navigating the same world that demanded far too much from people like them. Jada had leaned on them when she could, laughing through forced smiles and whispering encouragements that she barely felt herself, because she knew tomorrow would demand the same armor of patience and strength. Money had always been tight. She had bills stacked like leaning towers, rent that seemed to grow faster than her paycheck, groceries that required careful calculations, and the occasional medical expense that left her panicked and scrambling. She kept a ledger tucked into her worn wallet, numbers scribbled in hasty handwriting, evidence of a life spent measuring survival rather than comfort. Yet she persisted. Each day, Jada reminded herself that she was moving forward, even if only an inch at a time. She carried the weight of her ambitions quietly, dreams of one day leaving the diner, going back to school, starting her own small business, anything that would allow her to breathe without the constant pressure of being unseen and undervalued. And beneath the weight of exhaustion and responsibility, there was always that quiet pulse of hope, fragile but stubborn, like a small candle flickering against the wind. It was what had carried her through years of unfair treatment, what had kept her walking home late at night when the streets felt like they belonged to everyone but her. That night, as she walked those rain-slick streets, every step reminded her of all she had endured. The memory of a customer's sneer, the sting of a coworker's words, the hollow ache of a body that had labored endlessly, all of it pressed against her chest. Yet through the fear that had tightened around her heart like a vice, she carried the faintest ember of determination. She would get home. She would survive. She had survived this far, she could survive tonight. And still, even as she recalled the small victories and defeats of her day, the shadows of her past seemed to creep closer. Every alley she passed, every flicker of movement in the darkness, reminded her that the world could be cruel and that sometimes, survival was not enough. There were moments when courage faltered, when the sheer weight of being seen as less than human pressed down until it threatened to bend her spine and break her stride. Yet Jada had learned something vital over time. She had learned to recognize the signs, the subtle hints that told her when she was safe and when she was in danger. Years of walking alone, of navigating spaces where her presence was minimized or threatened, had sharpened her instincts. Her eyes scanned the streetlights, her ears caught the faintest echo of footsteps, and her body prepared for flight even when her heart longed to rest. And that was when she saw them, the bikers, without fully understanding why. It was as if her life of vigilance had trained her to notice what others could not. The gleam of chrome, the low hum of engines, the subtle aura of power and purpose, they had been there in the periphery of her night, unnoticed by the men who followed her, but impossible for her to ignore. For a brief moment, Jada allowed herself to imagine a different world. One where people noticed you not just to harm you but to protect you. A world where kindness was visible in those who seemed frightening at first glance. A world where fear could give way to hope, even on a rainy, lonely street. Her mind returned to memories of her family. She had grown up learning to hide vulnerability, to hold back tears, to swallow fear and to present strength. Her mother had been the same, resilient, proud, quietly courageous, but there had been lessons in both love and toughness, lessons that had shaped her into the woman who now walked alone in the rain, tired but unbroken. She thought of her younger brother, who looked up to her even though he rarely admitted it. She owed him safety and she owed herself survival. Every hardship she had endured, every invisible slight, and every late night and early morning had prepared her for this. And yet, despite all that preparation, she had not anticipated this moment of recognition. The instant where someone, somewhere, finally saw the weight she carried and chose to act. Jada's steps slowed slightly, a tremor running through her exhausted limbs, but she did not stop. Something deep in her chest stirred, a small spark of hope flickering through the fatigue. The fear remained, how could it not? But now it was tempered by the possibility that she was not as invisible as she had believed. That maybe, just maybe, someone had noticed her struggle and that notice could mean safety. The night pressed on, cold and wet, but in that moment Jada felt a shift. The streets that had seemed endless, threatening, and lonely now carried a glimmer of something else. The chance of being seen, being acknowledged, and being protected. And in that flicker of hope, she found herself breathing a little deeper, walking a little taller, and ready to face whatever came next. Jada's steps echoed softly against the slick pavement, a metronome of anxiety, each one measuring the distance between her and the unknown danger trailing her. The men behind her seemed to move with a patient cruelty, their laughter and whispered comments drifting on the damp night air. She felt the tension coiled tighter in her chest, her pulse pounding in her ears as if trying to drown out the city's hum. Every instinct honed by years of vigilance screamed at her. This was not a moment to falter. Then, from somewhere ahead, a faint rumble began. At first, it was indistinct, a low vibration underfoot, a subtle hum that could have been the distant subway or the city's heartbeat. But as Jada glanced over her shoulder, she saw a flicker of chrome glinting under the weak streetlights. Her breath caught. The sound grew louder, sharper, and more deliberate. Engines, more than one, cut through the night like rolling thunder. From the shadows, a group of bikers emerged, silhouettes etched against the dim glow of neon signs and puddles reflecting their imposing presence. Their bikes gleamed even in the drizzle, polished chrome and black steel that caught the streetlight in flashes like lightning. The rumble of their engines wasn't just noise, it was authority, presence, a signal that they belonged to the night in a way she hadn't known she longed for. Jada froze both from fear and from awe. Something about them felt different from the men behind her. These bikers weren't predatory, they were watchful, protective. Almost like they could sense her vulnerability before she even realized it herself. The men following her noticed the shift in energy first. Their confident smirks faltered. The laughter wavered. They glanced at the bikers with a mix of curiosity and unease. The subtle power in the bikers' presence was palpable. They didn't yell or threaten. They didn't need to. Their stance, the way they leaned slightly forward on their bikes, the unspoken understanding between them, it was enough. Jada's chest tightened. She had never felt anything like this. These were people who could have been intimidating in another context, rough-edged and dangerous in appearance. Yet something in their eyes, something in the calm way they carried themselves, told her they were on her side. And without knowing why, she felt a flicker of hope, fragile yet undeniable. The lead biker, a tall man with a weathered face partially hidden under a helmet, slowed his bike to match her pace. He gave a small nod, not patronizing, not commanding, but affirming, almost like saying, "You're not alone. Not tonight." Jada's mind raced. Was she imagining it? Could they see what she could feel, the way her body had been bracing for attack for the past half hour? She kept walking, trying to hold her composure, but the fear that had weighed on her so heavily was beginning to lift, replaced by something almost foreign, relief. The bikers flanked her subtly, forming a quiet protective barrier between her and the men who had been following. The men's whispers faded into uncertainty. One stepped forward, trying to assert dominance, but the lead biker simply tilted his head, a silent signal that was enough to stop him in his tracks. It was not a threat. It was presence. It was recognition. In the brief silence, Jada realized that the bikers had seen what nobody else had noticed. Not the men, not the passing taxis, not the indifferent streetlights. They had seen her fear, her exhaustion, her struggle. And they had acted without question, without hesitation. The rain fell harder, droplets bouncing off helmets and jackets, but it no longer felt oppressive. It was just part of the night, a backdrop to the quiet courage of people who understood that sometimes being human meant protecting someone when no one else would. The lead biker spoke softly, just loud enough for her to hear, though she could barely make out the words over the rain and the engine hum. "Are you okay?" Jada nodded, unable to find words at first. Her throat felt tight, but the simple question, the concern in a voice she had expected to carry only danger, made her heart expand in a way she hadn't thought possible tonight. Another biker, younger, with a gentle expression despite the rough tattoos on his hands, gave her a reassuring smile. He didn't ask for thanks or explanation. There was no expectation. Just presence. Protection. Humanity. The men who had been following her took a hesitant step back, glancing at one another. Confidence had left their posture. Doubt and unease replaced the bravado that had carried them this far. They hadn't anticipated being watched, not by Jada, not by anyone, and certainly not by people who radiated both strength and care. Jada's eyes welled with tears, not just from fear, but from the profound realization that someone could see her struggle and respond with kindness instead of indifference. These bikers, rough-edged and misunderstood in the eyes of the world, had noticed her humanity when so many others had looked past it. The group continued moving, their engines a low hum in the background, escorting her down the street as the men finally gave up and retreated into the shadows. Jada felt the weight she had been carrying, fear, exhaustion, loneliness, begin to shift, like a storm breaking after long days of rain. For the first time tonight she felt seen. Not in a fleeting glance, not in a passing acknowledgement, but in the deliberate, unwavering focus of people who had recognized her struggle and chose to intervene. And as the bikers guided her through the empty streets, their quiet presence enveloping her like a shield, Jada allowed herself a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. She didn't know these people. She might never see them again. But in that moment she understood something fundamental. The world could be cruel, yes, but it could also be kind in ways that were unspoken, unexpected, and profoundly human. Somewhere in the night, under flickering streetlights and the soft fall of rain, hope found her. The men who had been following Jada had grown bolder, their unease replaced with frustration and anger. The presence of the bikers had rattled them, but only temporarily. Now, as they lurked on the wet sidewalk a few paces behind her, their hostility crystallized into something more deliberate, more dangerous. One of the men, taller than the rest and with a sneer that had been frozen in place for too long, stepped forward. "Hey girl," he called, voice dripping with false charm, "don't let those losers scare you. You coming with us?" Jada's heart raced, and for a moment, fear surged back, hot and suffocating. The night had felt a little lighter with the bikers there, but the men's sudden aggression reminded her that she was still vulnerable. She gripped her bag tighter, ready to bolt, but instinct and exhaustion collided. Her body wanted to flee, but the fear of tripping, of being cornered, pinned her in place. The lead biker noticed the movement immediately. Without a word, he shifted, positioning his bike slightly in front of Jada, creating a protective barrier. The others flanked him, forming a wall of black leather and chrome that radiated quiet authority. They didn't brandish weapons or shout threats. Their presence alone was enough to command attention, a force born of collective strength and moral certainty. The tall man scowled, his confidence faltering. He glanced at his companions, seeking reinforcement, but their expressions mirrored his own unease. The bikers weren't just observers, they were a wall, immovable, calm and commanding. "You better step back," the lead biker said, voice low and steady, carrying the weight of someone who had seen trouble and decided to meet it without hesitation. It was neither a threat nor a negotiation. It was a declaration: "We are here and this ends now." The antagonist laughed nervously, trying to regain some semblance of control. "What are you gonna do? Ride us down?" he mocked, gesturing toward the bikes, trying to provoke them, trying to intimidate Jada further. But the bikers didn't react with anger. Instead, they exuded patience and unshakable focus. The lead biker slowly dismounted, standing tall beside his bike, eyes locked on the man. There was no hurry, no panic, just presence. Another biker stepped forward slightly, cracking a faint, calm smile, as if to remind the antagonist that appearances could be deceiving. Strength did not always roar, it often waited. Jada's chest tightened, and she instinctively stepped a little closer to the bikers. Fear still lingered, but it was now tempered with trust. the kind that arises when someone's intentions are unmistakably clear. She felt a strange warmth, a sensation she hadn't allowed herself in a long time: safety. The men exchanged uneasy glances, realizing that intimidation had lost its power. One of them, younger and perhaps less sure of himself, muttered, "Let's go," but the taller man refused to budge. His pride, fragile and brittle, demanded he confront the bikers. "Move aside," he demanded, voice sharper this time, eyes narrowing. "She's coming with us." The lead biker tilted his head slightly, the wet streetlights catching the hard lines of his face. "No. She's not," he said simply. That was all it took. No shouting, no anger, just certainty. The tall man's sneer faltered. He took a threatening step closer, and instinctively the lead biker's hand brushed the throttle of his bike, not as a weapon but as a subtle warning. The low hum of the engines vibrated in the air like a prelude to something unavoidable. Jada's breath caught. The air around them seemed electric, charged with tension. Every instinct she had screamed that the moment was about to explode, that chaos could erupt at any second. And yet, in the midst of fear, she noticed something remarkable. The bikers were unwavering. Calm, strong, deliberate. They were not here to fight for pride or ego. They were here to protect. The tall man lunged, attempting to grab Jada's bag. One of the bikers moved faster than she could comprehend, intercepting him with a precise motion that sent the man stumbling backward. Another biker positioned himself between her and the group, arms out in a protective stance that seemed to radiate an invisible force. "You don't touch her," the lead biker said again, his voice carrying a quiet but undeniable command. "Not tonight. Not ever." The group of men froze. The younger ones began to step back, eyes wide, suddenly aware that the bikers were not just tough, they were fearless, and their fearlessness was rooted in a deep moral certainty that was impossible to challenge with threats alone. Jada's own fear began to transform. It twisted into something more complex, a combination of relief, awe, and disbelief. These strangers, rough and imposing to anyone else, were acting out of an innate sense of justice. They weren't looking for confrontation, they were looking to protect. And she felt it, fully and deeply, for the first time that night. She was not alone. The tall man finally backed off, grumbling under his breath, defeated by the unyielding presence of the bikers. They didn't chase him or escalate. They let him retreat, letting justice be served through authority, presence, and unwavering protection rather than violence. Jada's legs trembled as she exhaled, tears mingling with the rain on her cheeks. She had never experienced this level of care, this deliberate and human response to danger. The bikers didn't just stop the threat. They uplifted her, reminded her of her worth, and allowed her to feel safe when the world had made her feel so vulnerable for so long. One of the bikers, the young man with a calm smile, stepped closer, offering a hand. "You okay?" he asked gently, as if checking on her well-being mattered more than the danger that had just passed. I think so," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Thank you." The lead biker nodded, not in acknowledgement of thanks, but as if to convey, "You don't need to thank us. You deserve to be safe." In that moment, the rain no longer felt heavy. The shadows of the street seemed less threatening. And though the danger had been real, the experience of being seen, protected, and cared for had already begun to change something inside Jada. Fear was still there, yes, but it had been tempered by trust, kindness, and the knowledge that she was not invisible. The bikers guided her a few more steps down the street, ensuring the men who had followed her had disappeared into the night. Jada realized something she had never admitted aloud, that even in a world that often overlooked or dismissed her, there were people who could act with courage, empathy, and humanity. And sometimes they came in forms you least expected. Rough edges, chrome, tattoos, engines, and all. That night, as the rain fell around them and the city hummed quietly, Jada learned that protection could come without malice, without expectation, and without a price. Sometimes, it simply came because someone saw you when nobody else did, and decided to act. The rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle, turning the city streets into a quiet, glistening canvas under the soft glow of streetlights. The bikers moved with deliberate calm around Jada, forming a protective cocoon that seemed to hold the chaos of the night at bay. Their engines hummed softly, a comforting vibration beneath her feet, steady as a heartbeat. Jada's legs were still trembling, her chest rising and falling as she tried to catch her breath. The fear that had gripped her for so long now mingled with disbelief and awe. These men, strangers moments ago, had acted with a kind of intentional care she had rarely, if ever, experienced. One of the bikers, the young man with the gentle expression, noticed her shaking and spoke softly. "It's okay. You're safe now." She blinked, tears slipping down her cheeks, and nodded. I don't know how to thank you." He smiled, but there was no pride in it. Just understanding. "You don't have to thank us. You deserve to feel safe." The lead biker, tall and imposing, now removed his helmet, letting the rain fall across his weathered face. His eyes were steady and calm, yet kind. "Walk with us for a little," he suggested. "We'll make sure you get home without trouble." Jada hesitated, instinctively wanting to refuse, afraid of imposing, afraid of being a burden. But something in their presence, something in the quiet authority that radiated from them, made her pause her refusal. She felt seen in a way she hadn't in years. The thought of walking alone, the crushing weight of solitude she had carried every day, now felt a little lighter. As they moved down the street together, the bikers didn't just escort her. They spoke to her, softly, casually, but with intention. They asked her how her night had gone, not in a superficial way, but as if they genuinely wanted to know the truth. Jada found herself opening up, words spilling out about her long shift, the rude customers, the exhaustion in her body, and the quiet victories she carried in her heart. She spoke about the little things like helping an elderly regular carry his coffee to his car or making a child laugh at the diner with a silly joke. She spoke about the bills, the tight finances, and the dreams she barely allowed herself to think about. And as she spoke, the bikers listened, without judgment, without interruption, without dismissiveness. They simply acknowledged her story with nods, with the subtle gestures of respect that felt profound after a lifetime of being ignored. The rain softened even more, the streets reflecting their figures in a mirror of light and water. One of the bikers, older, with a gray streak in his hair and deep lines etched in his face, shared a story of his own struggle. He spoke of nights like this years ago, walking alone, facing people who wanted to intimidate or harm him. He told her how someone had stepped in for him once, how that act of care had changed the way he saw the world, giving him hope when he thought all was lost. Jada listened, heart swelling. It was more than protection. It was connection. It was humanity. It was proof that the world could still hold kindness, even in the corners she had long assumed were dark and indifferent. As they continued, one of the bikers offered to carry her bag. She hesitated, embarrassed, but then allowed him to take it. The weight lifted from her shoulders was more than physical. It was symbolic, a momentary relief from the burdens she carried daily. For the first time that night, she felt the freedom to exhale, to let someone else share in the weight she bore alone so often. The lead biker looked at her with quiet insistence. "You've been through a lot tonight. Don't be afraid to let someone help you. Strength isn't always about going alone, it's about knowing when to accept care." Jada's lips quivered as tears filled her eyes again. She nodded, unable to speak. There were no words adequate to convey the mixture of fear, relief, and awe coursing through her. She had lived her entire life carrying herself, defending herself, surviving alone, and now for the first time in memory she felt someone deliberately choosing to walk with her, to protect her, to uplift her. They reached a small park bench a few blocks from her apartment. One of the bikers suggested they sit for a moment, allowing Jada to catch her breath. She sank onto the bench, soaked through from the rain, but feeling inexplicably lighter. Another biker, a woman in the group whose presence was fierce yet gentle, handed her a warm, dry jacket. "Put this on," she said softly. "You can't let yourself get sick out here." Jada accepted it, feeling the warmth of the fabric against her skin. The gesture, simple yet profound, moved her deeply. In her world, gestures like this were rare, almost unimaginable. She had spent so long proving her resilience, proving her worth through endurance alone, that the idea someone would offer kindness without expectation felt revolutionary. The bikers sat nearby, giving her space but remaining close enough that their presence was a steadying force. They spoke quietly among themselves, laughing softly at shared memories, exchanging nods and knowing glances. Their camaraderie was contagious, a living reminder that people could choose solidarity over self-interest, compassion over indifference. Jada found herself sharing more of her story, the dreams she barely allowed herself to admit aloud, the fears she had buried deep within her chest, and the weight of living in a world that often overlooked her worth. And as she spoke, the bikers listened, validating her existence in ways no one had before. Every nod, every reassuring glance, every soft word was an affirmation. You matter. You're seen. You're worthy of care. The moment grew quietly monumental. Jada's hands, once trembling with fear, now rested on her lap. Her shoulders, heavy with tension, eased slightly. The storm that had raged inside her for years, the fear, the exhaustion, the constant need to survive alone, began to break, melting in the presence of people who had chosen to act with kindness when the world had failed to notice. One of the younger bikers spoke gently, breaking the soft hum of conversation. You're stronger than you realize. Not because you faced them alone tonight, but because you've faced every day like this, tired, overlooked, carrying more than anyone should. That takes courage. Jada's chest tightened, tears spilling freely now. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel both her vulnerability and her strength at the same time. She realized that being strong didn't mean enduring alone. It meant surviving, yes, but also allowing oneself to be uplifted, to be seen, and to be cared for. The older biker leaned closer slightly. We don't do this because it's heroic. We do it because it's right. Someone had to notice you and someone had to act. That's all there is to it. In that moment, Jada felt an overwhelming surge of gratitude and awe. It wasn't just about safety anymore. It was about human connection, about the raw, simple truth that kindness could exist in forms she hadn't expected. The bikers, with their rough edges, tattoos, and imposing presence, were the embodiment of a truth she had longed to see, that care and protection often come from the places you least anticipate. Hours could have passed in that brief, rain-soaked park, the world outside fading into insignificance. Jada felt lighter than she had in years, her spirit buoyed by the deliberate acts of empathy and protection surrounding her. The bikers weren't seeking recognition or reward. They simply existed as witnesses and guardians, reminding her that the world, despite its cruelty and indifference, still held people capable of profound human kindness. As the rain finally ceased and the night began to recede into the faint promise of dawn, the bikers prepared to leave. One of them handed Jada her bag, now dry and safe, while another gave her a gentle pat on the shoulder. You'll be okay, the lead biker said. Remember this night. Remember that someone saw you and chose to act. Jada nodded, words failing her, heart overflowing with emotion. She watched them ride off, engines rumbling softly, disappearing into the dark streets. And as she stood there, alone yet profoundly transformed, she understood a truth she would carry forever. Kindness, courage, and humanity often appear where least expected, but when they do, they change everything. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jada allowed herself to smile. Not the forced smile of someone surviving, but the quiet, deep smile of someone who had been seen, protected, and uplifted. The world had been harsh, yes, but tonight she had been reminded that it could also be beautifully human. And in that human connection, in that quiet, profound affirmation of her worth, Jada felt something shift inside her. She was no longer just surviving the night, she was being transformed by it. The rain had ceased, leaving the city streets glistening under the first whispers of dawn. Jada walked the remaining blocks to her apartment slowly, each step lighter than the last. The fear that had pressed against her chest for so long was no longer sharp and suffocating. It had softened, tempered by the presence of those who had chosen to act with courage, empathy, and kindness. For years, Jada had carried the weight of the world alone. Nights like this, walking home exhausted, wary of every shadow, were familiar terrain. She had always survived, but she had never felt protected, never felt seen, never felt the quiet reassurance that she mattered beyond her ability to endure. And tonight that had changed. She paused outside her building, leaning against the familiar brick wall, and allowed herself to breathe fully. She closed her eyes, letting the memory of the biker's presence wash over her. The calm authority, the gentle smiles, and the words spoken softly but meaningfully. She could still feel the warmth of the jacket one of them had draped over her shoulders, the way another had carried her bag without expectation, and the quiet insistence that she was worthy of care. Tears gathered in her eyes once again, but this time, they were not only from fear, they were tears of realization. She had been surviving for so long, thinking strength meant facing the world alone, but now she understood something profound. Strength also meant allowing herself to be uplifted, to accept help, to be seen, to believe that her life and her well-being mattered. Jada stepped inside her apartment, the familiar surroundings both comforting and stark. The room smelled faintly of coffee and the lingering remnants of her morning routine. She set down her bag and sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her reflection in the cracked mirror across the room. The face staring back at her was familiar, yet different. Her eyes, still lined with exhaustion, held a spark of something new, a quiet fire born from trust, validation, and the realization that she could be more than just a survivor. She thought about the bikers as if replaying a vivid dream. The older biker's calm voice reminded her that someone had to notice, that someone had to act. The young man's gentle insistence that it was okay to accept care. The woman's fierce yet tender gesture of handing her a jacket. Every detail etched itself into her memory, forming a blueprint for how she might see herself going forward, not as someone defined solely by endurance, but as someone deserving of protection, kindness, and respect. Jada's thoughts drifted to her family. She had always felt responsible for shielding them from the harshness of life, often at the expense of her own emotional well-being. Now she realized that she didn't have to carry every burden alone. Accepting care didn't make her weak, it made her human. It made her capable of embracing a fuller, more connected life. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she was not merely surviving but thriving. She pictured walking down streets without fear, moving through the world with confidence rooted not only in resilience but also in the understanding that she could rely on others when needed. She envisioned her dreams, returning to school, pursuing the goals she had set aside, building a life that reflected her worth and ambition, and felt a surge of courage to pursue them. The memory of the biker's eyes lingered in her mind. There was no judgment there, no condescension, only recognition. Recognition that she was valuable, that her life mattered, and that she deserved safety and dignity. That recognition, simple and profound, had shifted something inside her. She felt empowered, not because they had saved her, but because their actions had reminded her that she was already worthy of care and respect. Jada stood and moved to her small kitchen, making a cup of tea. As the warmth seeped into her hands, she felt a sense of grounding she hadn't known in a long time. The physical comfort mirrored the emotional one she carried now. A sense of stability, a quiet reassurance that she could move forward with grace, even in the face of life's persistent challenges. She thought about the world outside, about the streets she had always walked with cautious vigilance. She realized she no longer had to move through them in constant fear. She could carry the memory of kindness with her, a shield of human connection that would bolster her when shadows crept too close. That memory, that feeling would be her guide. Jada allowed herself a small smile, fragile but real. She imagined the bikers riding into the distance, engines fading into the early morning, leaving her not just safe but transformed. She understood that the night's events were not just about protection, they were about reclamation. The world had tried to define her as powerless, invisible, and alone. And yet, in the midst of fear and uncertainty, she had been reminded of her agency, her worth, and her capacity to accept care without shame. She sat back, closing her eyes, and let the tears come freely now. They were not tears of fear or exhaustion, but of release, of recognition, of transformation. She could feel the tension in her shoulders melting, the tightness in her chest easing. She was beginning to breathe again, not just physically but emotionally and spiritually. Jada whispered to herself, softly but with conviction, "I am worthy. I am seen. I am safe. I can move forward." In that quiet moment, she felt a subtle but undeniable shift. Her posture straightened, her shoulders squared. The night's terror had left its mark, yes, but it had also delivered something far more enduring. A renewed sense of self, a deepened understanding of her own resilience, and a recognition that she did not have to face the world alone. She thought about tomorrow, about continuing her life with the knowledge that someone had noticed her when it mattered most. That recognition became a seed, small but potent, taking root in her mind. It reminded her that courage could coexist with vulnerability, that strength was not solitary, and that human connection, unexpected, fleeting, or lasting, had the power to transform. For the first time in a long time, Jada allowed herself hope. Not the fleeting, fragile kind she had clung to in secret, but a grounded, growing hope that she could navigate life with renewed confidence. She could face her fears, her exhaustion, and her challenges with the knowledge that she was not invisible, that she was worthy, that she was capable of receiving care without guilt or shame. Jada stood, feeling the renewed energy coursing through her limbs. She moved with intention, preparing to face the day ahead. The memory of the bikers and their acts of kindness and protection would remain with her forever, a guide and reminder that humanity often exists in the most unexpected forms and that when we are seen and valued, transformation is inevitable. And as the morning light began to filter through her window, Jada smiled again, this time fully, deeply, with the understanding that her journey had shifted. She was no longer just a survivor of the night. She was a young woman reclaimed, empowered, and ready to move forward with courage, hope, and a newfound sense of self-worth. The morning light stretched across the city, painting the wet streets with soft gold, reflecting in puddles that mirrored the quiet beauty of a new day. For Jada, the streets felt different now, less threatening, less oppressive, and more like a space where she belonged. The night's terror had passed, leaving in its wake a profound transformation, an awakening to the truth that kindness could exist even in unexpected forms, and that her life held value beyond survival. She walked slowly, savoring each step as she approached her apartment. The bag she carried felt lighter, her jacket warm against her skin, and a sense of quiet courage hummed in her chest. Memories of the biker's protective presence floated in her mind. The lead biker's unwavering calm, the gentle insistence of the younger man, and the woman's fierce kindness in offering the jacket. These weren't just gestures. They were proof that humanity could shine even in the darkest moments, that people could act with intention and care without expectation, and that she was worthy of being seen, uplifted, and protected. Jada paused on the steps of her building, looking out over the quiet streets. The night was over, but the lesson remained. She realized that the biker's intervention was not just about her immediate safety, it was about a deeper truth, that human connection, compassion, and moral courage could change the course of someone's life. She allowed herself to feel that deeply, acknowledging it fully. The weight of years of fear, invisibility, and exhaustion seemed to lift, replaced by a fragile but growing sense of empowerment. Inside her apartment, Jada took a moment to sit by the window, watching as the city stirred to life. Children's laughter carried faintly from a nearby playground, cars hummed softly along the streets, and the smell of brewing coffee drifted from a corner cafe. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, feeling a sense of calm she hadn't known in years. Her thoughts drifted to the men who had followed her the night before, the ones who had sought to intimidate and harm. She realized something vital. The bikers had not only protected her, they had shown her a different path, a way to respond to fear and danger with courage, clarity, and moral integrity. They had modeled a version of humanity she had longed for, a blueprint for how to carry herself in the world with dignity and strength. Jada's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her journal, a small notebook she rarely wrote in. She opened it, pen poised, and began to write, not about fear or exhaustion but about hope, transformation, and the kindness she had witnessed. Each word felt like a declaration, a way to anchor the lessons of the night into her consciousness. Tonight I was seen. Tonight I was protected. Tonight I learned that strength is not just about endurance, it's about allowing others to care, about recognizing kindness, and about reclaiming your worth. Tears spilled onto the page, warm and cathartic. For years, Jada had carried her burdens silently, believing that asking for help was a weakness. But tonight had shown her otherwise. She had experienced something profoundly human, the deliberate choice of others to act with empathy, courage, and love. And in that choice, she had discovered the power to transform herself. The hours passed quietly, each one reinforcing the lessons of the night. Jada's reflection in the mirror looked different now, not just tired but alive with the knowledge of her own value. She touched her face gently as if confirming the truth she had just learned. She was worthy of protection, kindness, and respect. Later that day, Jada walked through her neighborhood with a newfound confidence. She greeted neighbors, smiled at passers-by, and even lingered to help a small child who had dropped a toy on the sidewalk. Each act, small as it seemed, was imbued with the spirit of the lesson she had learned from the bikers. That kindness was contagious, that empathy could ripple outward, and that even the smallest gestures could transform someone's day, or perhaps their life. Jada reflected on her future with a clarity she had never known. She would return to her studies, pursue her dreams, and build a life that honored her worth. She no longer felt trapped by the limitations she had imposed on herself through fear and exhaustion. The bikers had shown her that life could contain both danger and protection, cruelty and kindness, but that she had the power to choose how she responded to it. Weeks later, Jada found herself walking home again after a long shift. The streets were familiar, but she no longer felt the same anxiety that had haunted her steps before. She had changed, internally, profoundly. Her posture was straighter, her eyes alert but calm, and her stride confident. She carried herself not with the tense vigilance of someone who feared the world, but with the quiet strength of someone who knew she was seen, valued, and capable. As she reached a familiar corner, she noticed a small group of bikers parked quietly nearby. Their presence didn't startle her. Instead, it felt like a reminder of the night that had shifted everything. She offered a small, grateful smile, which one of the bikers returned with a subtle nod. There were no words necessary, only the recognition that the bonds of humanity could be simple, profound, and transformative. That evening, Jada shared her story with a close friend, recounting the fear she had felt, the intervention of the bikers, and the lessons she had learned. Her voice was steady, filled with the resonance of someone who had faced darkness and emerged with clarity and strength. Her friend listened in awe, tears welling in their own eyes, recognizing the depth of the transformation Jada had experienced. Jada realized then that the night's events had not only changed her, it had created a ripple effect, touching others through her story. She understood that courage, kindness, and moral integrity were not only about immediate actions but also about inspiring others to act similarly. The biker's choice to intervene had planted seeds, and she could now carry those seeds forward, nurturing them through her own words and deeds. Weeks turned into months, and the memory of that night remained vivid. Every time Jada faced a challenge, she recalled the quiet, unwavering presence of the bikers and the profound lesson they had imparted, that being human meant caring, protecting, and uplifting others whenever possible. That night had taught her that fear could be met with courage, loneliness with connection, and despair with hope. And so, Jada lived differently. She moved through the world with intention, carrying the memory of kindness like a talisman. She treated others with empathy, noticed the struggles of those around her, and acted in small but meaningful ways to lift those who were burdened. In doing so, she honored the biker's act of humanity and transformed her own life into a living testament to the power of compassion. The moral became clear to her, deeply and undeniably: every life matters. Every struggle deserves recognition. And the smallest acts of kindness can transform fear into hope, vulnerability into strength, and strangers into guardians. Years later, Jada would recount this story not with bitterness or fear, but with gratitude and reverence. She would remember the night she walked home alone, trembling, invisible, and exhausted, and the bikers who saw her when no one else did, who acted without expectation, and who reminded her that she was worthy. It was more than protection, it was a revelation. It was a moral carved into her heart, that when we choose to act with courage, empathy, and humanity, we can change the course of another's life. And in doing so, we change the world one act of kindness at a time. Jada smiled, feeling the truth in her bones. She had survived the night, yes, but she had also been transformed by it. And as she stepped into the sunlight, breathing deeply, moving forward with renewed courage, she understood the simplest and most profound truth of all. Being seen, being protected, and being uplifted is not just a gift. It is a spark that can ignite hope, transform hearts, and remind us all of our shared humanity.